Hey, morning everybody. My name is Wassim, and we're going to kick things off today with a panel on economic and social risks. So we're joined from stage left to right. Is that wrong or right? Felix Weis, Max Hillebrand, and Aaron van Wirdum. Would you like to introduce yourselves to the audience?
Yeah, I'm Felix. I write software and I travel with Bitcoin, and I'm interested in risks and rewards for Bitcoin.
Yes, I'm Max. I'm an educator mostly on the World Crypto Network, and I support many open source projects like Wasabi or Coldcard or Nodl or many of the other all cool, awesome Bitcoin stuff.
I'm Aaron van Wirdum. I'm technical editor at Bitcoin Magazine. I may also call myself a historian. I studied politics and society in historical perspective at Utrecht University, so maybe that helps make sense why I'm on the panel. That's it.
Okay, so we thought we might try to do some contextual framing to start things off. So hopefully we can, yes, bring this up. So this is just a very simple kind of stack of layers framework to try and map that traditional OSI kind of idea onto blockchain networks. And there was this young fellow called Vitalik Buterin who made something a bit simpler than this, and we extended it in an article in the Mesh not so long ago. So the general idea is if we can abstract out a few different layers, then we can be a bit more precise in the language and the terminology that we employ. So as this panel is primarily on economic and social risks, we'll be looking at these upper two layers of the stack, the monetary and the social political. So really we're talking about where the kind of grinding gears of protocol engineering and distributed systems meet the kind of soft, squishy bags of meat and water that we find ourselves as. So should we kick off by the big social question? Is there a culture? Is there a culture of Bitcoin?
Is there a culture? I think the way I understand the word culture is like anything that humans produce, right? So anything that's from roads to bridges to art. So I definitely think that there is this Bitcoin culture thing, right? So it's all the people that are working or educating or, so there's definitely a culture there.
Yeah, it's a very good question, because after all, Bitcoin is made up by individuals, and we all have our individual preferences and beliefs. And because Bitcoin is so very inclusive, where anyone can participate in this open source venture, I would argue that we have a very, wide and quite broad culture. But of course, it is based fundamentally on this ethos of libre sound money, of having a money that is chosen voluntarily by the individual. And I think that is a good common starting place to start out with. And although we have different nuances in our point of views, we can all come together in our beliefs that a free sound money is the way to go.
Yeah. People like to think, especially in the Bitcoin world, that Bitcoin is sort of this machine. It just operates, and us puny humans don't really have any influence on it. It does what it does, and that's sort of a comforting idea, but I also think it's wrong. Ultimately, Bitcoin is made out of people using it, running it, deciding what they think is Bitcoin. The way I see Bitcoin, it's the term I like to use is shared fiction. This term was popularized by an Israeli historian. His name is Yuval Noah Harari, and he explains the history of the world, the history of humanity, with this concept. So to name it helps us cooperate. So, and this is the way he explains it. This is what makes humans fundamentally different from animals, right? You cannot tell a monkey, you have this banana. If you give me this banana now, you'll go to banana heaven, and it will be bananas for the rest of your life. And convince this monkey that it will give you this banana. With a human, you can actually convince a human to do this. So you can convince a human to act differently than just the material world that's around him.
Go beyond the immediate sphere.
Yes, so you can tell a human a story, and that will help him, or that will let people cooperate in a different way. So religion is a very obvious example of that, but we see that all around us. We see that, you know, states are this, companies are this, institutions are this, sports events. Ajax had a great run in the Champions League this year. There were like 50,000 people in the stadium. They were all enjoying the match, and everyone knew what was going on. Like there was the Ajax players, they wore these colors, and there was the referee, and he had a different job. There was the owner of the stadium, and all the people there, and everyone believed in this shared fiction. There was a whole other stadium, a whole other country. It was the same tournament for some reason. Like everyone agrees that this was the same thing. It's a huge shared fiction. Put 50,000 chimpanzees in a stadium, and it will be chaos, right? So it's humans that are we're telling each other this story. And a huge story that we tell each other is money. And money really helps us cooperate across vast distances, even with people we hate or don't trust. Like money is the key to help us cooperate in this way. And I think Bitcoin is really a new type of shared fiction that we all agree on. And I think that supersedes the technology. A concrete example would be the inflation bug that was introduced in the code, in the Bitcoin core base a while ago. Now, if we imagine that bug would have been exploited and there would have inflation would have happened, I don't think Bitcoin users, I don't think all of us would have said, oh, well, that's what the technology did. Like now there's more than 21 million Bitcoins because that's what happens, and obviously the technology. No, we'd have said, you know what? Our shared fiction, our idea of Bitcoin is this 21 million limit. It's super important. That's why we care so much about that. This was an obvious bug. We're going to fix it, right? So this idea, the shared belief, the shared fiction supersedes the technology. So
what if there are competing shared fictions that emerge that have different sets of priorities, beliefs, or cultural attachments, technological priorities, and so on?
It's interesting in Bitcoin that not everyone shares every aspect of the shared fiction, I think. The 21 million limit is a good example of something like almost everyone agrees with that. There are some talks about maybe, you know, that could be lifted in the future, but this is something everyone agrees on. But there are other parts.
Sounds more like a fork to me, like there will be a hard fork and there will be a alternative
at some point,
network
probably.
with a non-standard supply cap.
So let's take the block size limit. This was, for some people, like a very important part of the shared fiction. Like we need that block size limit because that allows us to use the technology in a certain way, and it allows us to run a full node. And other people didn't have that block size limit in their idea of Bitcoin. So they had a very different idea of what Bitcoin was or should be. So that can lead to splits in the common belief.
Felix, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm actually not so sure if this. I mean, I hope that this idea of the 21 million Bitcoin is one of this shared belief. But I meet a lot of people, mostly like in taxis or Ubers, and they've heard about Bitcoin, but they actually don't know about the 21 million coin limit, right? So maybe we have to do a better job at educating or that's actually part of Bitcoin. But it definitely shows that, which I think is one of the biggest risks also in Bitcoin, is that there's a growing gap between the users that understand Bitcoin in a certain way and understand it in another way.
So it's like an educational and a communication kind of gap.
I guess so. Maybe someone should, I don't know, start a podcast and educating people about that. Yeah, we do need more educational initiatives. Like shout out to Warren Tagami and Ruben Thompson for reading Bitcoin. That's really great. Hope to see more things like that for sure.
Yes, and I mean, education is absolutely important because it decreases this knowledge differential in the hierarchy of skill. And that is very powerful because it allows you to have more peers that are more skilled, that can help you in the division of labor much more eloquently. And that helps everyone, not just the peers that get educated, but also the teachers. And that's something that I've experienced with educating many about Bitcoin, is that I've learned myself a tremendous amount. And it's very fulfilling, not just to grow yourself, but to help others grow. So education education is absolutely key. But Aaron, I would say that although the social story is very important and that it is absolutely true, we have in Bitcoin the consensus code. So we actually have a very clearly codified set of rules on what this shared belief actually is, actually on running code. And so although the nuances, for example, the block size limit might be very, very difficult, that individuals might perceive these rules differently, but after all, it's in the code. And probably for not first time, but it's very novel to actually be able to prove this and to be here, this is actually the code, this is the rules, these are the things that we play by.
But this is which code are you referring to? Like which code we consider Bitcoin, that is the social consensus, right?
Exactly, that is again the individual preference of which rules do you actually choose.
I heard a really nice conception of it. I think it was Pierre Richard that described it as a intersubjective consensus between the technological and the social, protocol and the social.
I mentioned bridges as like being something like also can be considered as culture, right? So we want to build the longest or the biggest bridge or the highest building. And why we're doing this is like probably like a shared fiction around that beauty of these architectural things, but they're still like physical realities, right? So some materials they break if you put too much weight on them, right? So there's like real breaking points in the physical world that we just can't surpass, right? And I think that's one of the biggest risks that we don't see, or people just say, oh, let's build a bigger tower, just because the previous tower wasn't big enough, and eventually the thing falls apart, right? Because there are physical barriers. And that's the fundamental part of engineering, to like understand these trade-offs you make.
Yeah. I think I want to steer us on towards sort of matters of the material and real when we talk about sort of the thermodynamic aspect of economic risks. But for now, let's, so we talked about culture and the social layer, but we primarily spoke about it in terms of the collective embodiment, the shared fictions, as you said. But there's also this running strand of individuality, of hardcore individuality. So how do those two things resolve themselves? Do you want to start, Felix or Max?
I didn't get that.
Oh, so we have this kind of collective culture, but there's also a culture of individualism in Bitcoin. So, like, how do these things fit together?
I mean, if you would be the only person on planet Earth having all the money in the world, that wouldn't use you much, right? Because who would you exchange it with, and who would you trade with? So, yeah, the individual is obviously important, and it's important also that you learn to take care of your own keys, because I think that's also one of the biggest risks I see in Bitcoin, is that just as we had like consolidation of the big banks, the smaller banks disappeared and they got like merged into bigger and bigger banks. We know that hacks happen, and if you have a small scale hack of like 7,000 Bitcoin on an exchange, that might be like coverable. But if eventually we just have like 4 large custodial who hold like 98% of all the Bitcoins, and one of them gets hacked, and the hacks do happen, I'm not sure if the social consensus about no bailouts would actually continue to exist. So yeah, these are definitely risks in terms of how much, like, that we decentralize also the custodial thing to the individual, and not keep it all in a shared wallet because it's easier, or yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this interplay between individual and social is very interesting. An example of a fiction that can be very individual is actually religion. Like, you can believe in a certain God, and you can believe that you need to eat certain stuff or do certain rituals, or maybe you live your life in a certain way, and then when you die, like, you go to heaven, and that's like purely individual. Like, maybe you need to convince other people or try, but if you try, that's usually not for most religions. So it can be very individualistic. But because Bitcoin is money, it's almost the opposite. The whole point of money is that other people will want it. Like, you really got to think about not just what do I want, If it's just about what I want all the money, like Felix wants, and then no one else will have anything. Like that would be the individualistic thing. But with the money, everyone's actually thinking, what does everyone else want? So it's a very social thing. But it is true that everyone. Okay, so a good example would be what happened with Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. In Ethereum, it brings us back to like individual ownership of coins. In Ethereum Classic, in Ethereum, there was a smart contract, and something happened with the smart contract, and someone ended up with a whole bunch of coins. And then the Ethereum community, and we can argue about how centralized the decision was, but the Ethereum community decided, you know what, this guy doesn't own these coins, that's not right. We're gonna hard fork, we're gonna move to a new protocol where this guy doesn't have all the coins and we get all our coins back. So now this guy, who held all the coins at first, he can keep running the original code, and he can hold on to his own keys, and he can be very, very individualistic, but because everyone moves to another protocol, it's completely useless to him. So there is this and I think it's very important in Bitcoin that we have this shared fiction that we're not going to do that. Like if you own the coins, you own the coins. That's a very important key aspect of what we're doing here.
Yeah,
very good points, and I think that is where kind of both come together, because right, money is not a consumption good. You cannot eat Bitcoin to satisfy your hunger. It's also not a production good, right? You cannot build a farm to produce more food to then later satisfy your hunger. That's not possible with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a medium of exchange, so you hold it only because you want to exchange it for another production or consumption good in the uncertain future, right? So you want to trade in the future with your peers, but then the question is, how do you find these peers? And I think here Bitcoin and the act of running a full node is very important, because you started with an empty hardware, right? And then you compile the source code yourself. And with this, you actually make your monetary rules. And you can do anything. I mean, you could run a Ripple node, you could run a Bcash node, you could run a Bitcoin node. It really doesn't matter which consensus rules or which individual rules you use, you can do everything, right? But then as soon as you have compiled your Bitcoin full node, when you have specified your full node, then you connect to a network and you ask if there are other peers on this network that play by the same rules that are a potential partner for future trade. And then when you have connected to these nodes and you have collaborated with them in sharing this knowledge, then you're actually peers. And then we are this network of individuals. But ultimately, you yourself as the individual also verify and enforce these rules, meaning that as soon as one individual decides to change the rules in a way that is not in accordance to what you have specified in the first step, then you enforce your own set of rules by kicking this person out of the network. And you're no longer peers, and you're no longer a future trading partner. So in that sense here, Bitcoin is very individualistic and very anarchistic. But the anarchy is the agora, and this is the marketplace of sovereign individuals.
So it's both, it's and or. It just is. So shall we move on to forks?
Why not?
Yeah, so I'm sure I don't have to, give much of a background or recap on ledger forks like Bitcoin Cash, ABC, SV, private, diamonds, gold, and so on. But can we consider them in the context of economic and social risks? So if you think about networks that share the same mining algorithms, they in a way compete for the computational resource of miners, of the suppliers or producers.
Yeah, I think it's probably I don't know how much this is a common myth, but like it's very impossible to have two networks that share the same proof of work algorithm, because you end up usually with like a Pareto distribution of the hash power, or even worse, and then it's especially if they compete for the same user base, it's actually very fundamentally unsecure. So as long as the miners see more profit in keeping the illusion of both or the three chains being safe, they will continue to do so. But if somebody was to have a fun weekend, depending on how low the hash rate goes, they could just like do a large-scale double spend. I think Coinbase accepts BSV only after like 1,008 blocks, so that's like a week. I'm not sure if that's like super fast. But yeah, they understand that there are large risks of having competing proof-of-work chains.
Yeah, I've been tracking the kind of SHA-256 ecosystem of coins on a research project I was doing before. And one interesting thing is because of the series of difficulty adjustment algorithms that BCH made in the time after the fork, the hard fork in summer before last, they ended up about 6,000 to 7,000 blocks ahead of Bitcoin, which means they'll hit their halving first, which means their incentive, the miner subsidy will halve first. There will be a period of time before Bitcoin's is halved that theirs has. So, I mean, it's already 40 or 50 to 1, these like BTC versus BSV or BCH in terms of hash rate.
I think fork.lol, I think, is still very good research to like watch these forks diverge.
Yeah, sure. Max?
Very good point that that mining, especially with the same hashing algorithm, is a zero-sum game, right? And if you can take 4% of the Bitcoin hash rate to 51% attack the Bcash hash rate, it's not secure, right? It doesn't work under these assumptions. And then that's also why the most valid proof of work is the valid chain, right? So that definitely. But the act of forking is very unbelievably vitally important to Bitcoin. Because if we do not allow the opportunity for individuals to choose different rules than we do, then Bitcoin becomes the central planner in the economy and the tyrant that forces our rule set upon everyone else. And that would be very, very bad. So the ability of individuals to walk away and to choose a different set of rules than the incumbent system is vitally important. I mean, that's after all what we're doing with Bitcoin itself. And that's why Bitcoin is Libre and open source software. You can fork the code. You're very much encouraged to do so. Why? Because it's non-scarce. And actually, when you fork the code, you do not take it away from me. And that is very important. And this allows us to have this marketplace of different monetary set of rules, different consensus algorithms that can try different variables and different approaches. And only because we have this vast array of different monetary systems to choose from, do we have the power to actually choose that one which is marginally best. Now, I personally would believe, and I think most of you as well, that Bitcoin is marginally the best money that we have, but we only know that because there are 1,001 shitcoins out there that we could potentially choose. But because we choose Bitcoin, this actually proves the immense power of having such a Libre open source money.
I think it's a double-edged sword. I agree that it's fundamentally important that forking is possible, and it's also something we can't stop anyways, and that's a good thing. At the same time, I also see it as possibly the biggest risk to Bitcoin, personally. Let's go back to the Ajax example. Everyone has this shared fiction that this is Ajax, this is Juventus, and they're playing each other in this big stadium. Now, what if this shared consensus wasn't actually shared and other guys would step on the pitch and say, no, we're Ajax, who are you guys? And there would be this huge disagreement. Or in another stadium, there's a team that says, no, we played the game and we won, and Ajax won, and there's another Ajax playing and no one knows what's going on anymore, and there's no shared consensus there. Then the end result of that, it's a very hypothetical example because it's so solidified, everyone knows what Ajax is, but go along with the hypothetical example. It becomes such a mess that a tournament becomes impossible. You can't play the game if there's no agreement on what the game actually is or who the players are. The game becomes impossible. And all forks, I would say all forks we've seen in this industry so far have been relatively clean. Some have been more cleaner than others, but in all cases it was pretty clear what was happening. When Bitcoin Cash split off, they picked a new name, more or less. At least they added Cash and a new ticker, and the exchange is sort of solidified on, okay, this is where we're going. But I could see a potential risk in the future where it's not that clear, where it's more 50-50, and both sides really think they're the real Bitcoin, and both sides really, and there's this exchange that lists this Bitcoin as the real Bitcoin, and the other exchange is the other one, and you go to a merchant and you pay with Bitcoin, and he doesn't receive the money even though you send it, because apparently he's using a different Bitcoin. So shared fictions have this risk of not becoming shared anymore, and it can become a huge mess, and I think that this huge mess could even maybe bring down this whole experiment or be, I see this as maybe one of the biggest risks to this whole technology. It's a social risk, in my opinion.
So you see forks a bit like a kind of a black swan incubator or something like that?
I mean, black swans happen quite often, right? So if forks are black swans, then we all live in Australia, right? So I think there's not a big risk, and that is that that the community splits in large regards. So that's why it's very important to like probe for consensus that yes, we all want to like go along with this. It's probably not possible to all go along, but like if a very large majority wants to go along with a certain fork, that it would happen and not disrupt the community. Forks also have another risk, I think, and that is that a lot of people, they don't understand the nuances. They just see there's something called Bitcoin and there's something called Bitcoin Cash. This is cheaper. I'm going to buy that, right? So we should really make sure that we educate the different trade-offs certain coins make, and so it's clear to the people what they're getting into.
Very good points, and I would maybe like to add that Bitcoin is a very powerful technology, and we are on a pretty good path of succeeding. So the question would be, how do you stop such a thing? Maybe you introduce a bug in the software that's pretty difficult with the core review process, right? Maybe you shut down all the full nodes. That might also be possible, but pretty damn difficult. So I would say a good strategy would be to obfuscate, to create a lot of noise and to lead the masses onto this noise without actually seeing the volume which is actually spoken. So Bitcoin is extremely powerful, but everyone is talking about blockchain. And everyone is talking about stake on the blockchain and diamonds on the blockchain and healthcare on the blockchain, everything. But nobody really talks about the most important thing.
About supply chain.
Supply chain. Everything is on the blockchain. You see, we should have put in the supply chain on the blockchain, so I wouldn't have forgotten about it. It's immutable. That's how it works. But because then it's so difficult to kill Bitcoin, they need to somehow try to lead the people away from Bitcoin. And
delay, distract, deny, obfuscate.
Exactly, and I think forks can be something like this. Again, forks are very important, but if we start telling people, oh, this is the real Bitcoin, look at this, wow, it's magic, by leading them away from what is actually the real innovation here, then this can be very difficult and very risky for Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I've got a segue here. So what if this delay, distract, deny could be an effective tactic? And the outcome of that tactic is that it pushes the development of the kind of economic and social layers of Bitcoin to the extent that we don't achieve a sufficient transaction fee market as the mining subsidy attenuates over time. We fail to provide sufficient incentive for the thermodynamic defense of the network, and then we go the way of some other projects that have fared ugly fates. So I guess this is about the block space market.
Yeah. I think one topic that I would bring up in this context is sort of the Paul Stork argument. Right now, whether we like it or not, altcoins are competition to Bitcoin. And if fees on Bitcoin get to a certain level, then altcoins are going to act as a substitute good for some use cases. Like, for example, if you just want to move fiat one end to fiat on the other end, then it's going to make sense to use an altcoin instead and pay a lower fee. If you want to have Bitcoin on one end, Bitcoin on the other, not so much. But for certain use cases, that's true. His idea for drive chains is to actually just capture all of that. A drive chain is a sidechain that's merge mined, and then instead of having all of these altcoins take up this competition, the Bitcoin miners, you give them an extra opportunity to make money. There's an extra incentive for on-chain transactions because the sidechain still got to settle there, and the fees on the sidechain itself need to will still go to the Bitcoin miners as well. So I think that's actually a very good argument that's not brought up very often. I think that's a very good argument for drive chain. They have their trade-offs, and we can discuss these. But I think that would be a topic that I think deserves more discussion. Like, it could be a potential solution to this problem, or part of it.
Other sidechains also exist and may relieve competition for block space as well.
Yes, but in that case, they don't necessarily go to miners, right? Which, in this context of the question you posed, is actually a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, shitcoins can be seen as competing substitute goods, but that really depends on what's your security model, right? And so that's also a risk in Bitcoin, that if the subsidy runs out, then the security is no longer proven, or if there's a big price crash, miners might switch their hash power to other chains, right? These are all definitely possible risk. I don't think they are a very large risk, but you should know about them. And the question is still out on like whether the utility of Bitcoin in the long run will be large enough for people to willingly pay fees for that security.
I think the baseline of, or misconception about this argument is that even for altcoins or for Bitcoin in the early days, that transactions were cheap, or block space more generally, which was never ever the case. Block space was always extremely expensive. I mean, 50 Bitcoin in the Coinbase reward is a lot. It really is a lot. I mean, 50 Bitcoin are quite a couple Satoshis. 5 million, I mean, 5 million Satoshis is a lot. So the thing is that we have an indirect subsidy that pays for the hashing power of Bitcoin and the mining. And this indirect subsidy is paid. It's an economic cost. And it's paid via the Cantillon effect that all the hodlers who receive the newly printed money later, they give their purchasing power to those that receive the newly printed money first, which is, of course, the miners and the electricity companies and the hardware providers and all the chain of the Cantillon effect. So this is an economic cost that we do pay, and we do pay from day one, and it's quite a huge part of the fee that we pay. Now, more and more, we have the direct payment that is paid by the individual who actually uses the block space. And I would argue that an indirect subsidy, as is with the issuance rate, leads to a worse resource allocation. So we have scarce block space, only a limited number of transactions can use it, and that's exclusive. And we have here also then the demand for it, right? People want to make or settle transactions on the individual network of peers. So it's difficult to see here how much are we willing to pay for this, because everyone pays for it. Like right now we probably all hold Bitcoin and we currently don't make any transactions, but still we all pay for the transactions of others. And therefore we don't really have a say on where this scarce resource of block space should be allocated. And so although the cost was already tremendous high in the early days, it was, most of it, I would say, malinvested and overconsumed. So hopefully with moving more to a direct fee payment for the market of block space, I would hope and wager that we actually see a more efficient resource allocation, where with less capital we can achieve more security, which then hopefully would solve this issue as well.
It's also, the fees are as high as the market makes them, right? And people can choose other kinds. But I think fees are actually pretty low in historical comparison. Because I think in the beginning, where we had not like dynamic fees, I think there was a fixed fee of 0.1 Bitcoin. Unless you had enough, your UTXO was old enough, and you would get like the free thing. But like if you would transact a lot, you would pay 10 million satoshis for a transaction, and I don't think I've paid in recent time that much.
Yeah, I remember when people were complaining about the very block op return overhead on the chain, that the fees had spiked, and then people zoomed out and looked again at 2016, 17, 18, and yeah, in comparison, the fees are not that high right now. Yeah. What about other off-chain or abstracted layers? So we spoke a little bit about sidechains. What about Lightning Network? Is Lightning Network is there a risk there that it will make the network top-heavy? As you might say, smart contract platforms that issue tokens, they look top-heavy. A lot of their value is on upper layers. Does that cause problems for the foundations? Are we building castles in the sand here?
I paid yesterday for my beer with Lightning, and worked great. I'm on one hand, I'm optimistic that we will continue this engineering effort, and we can already see like the early stages of that, and but yeah, it's still question like how easy can we make the UX for not so technical users, that it's actually here you can just like tap your credit card with NFC, and that all works great, and you don't have to care about all the technical details that happen in the background. But yeah, there's challenges ahead for sure.
Well, Lightning Network is a really smart thing, or a smart contract, where we actually use a channel, a multi-sig script that shares the ownership of scarce Bitcoin with amongst peers, and then we shift this shared ownership in the balance from left to right. But we do it in a way that we do not require the nodes, all the full nodes, to verify every single state, which in this sense is, of course, a lot more scalable and a lot more private, because we don't tell everyone everything, but we only use this court system of the time chain when we actually need it, when there is a dispute and when we do need to settle something, or, of course, when we want to open or close the state. So Lightning Network, it's not an altcoin, it's hopefully not a Ponzi scheme, but it's just a very smart way of transferring the property rights in scarce Bitcoin without relying directly on the verification of all the full nodes on the network.
It kind of uses also the idea of the 6 degrees of separation, right? So, but even if you have 6 degrees of separation, that doesn't mean you trust everybody in these 6 degrees, right? But using these smart contracts, we can eliminate that need for trust, or at least reduce it to an absolute minimum.
So 6 degrees of separation. Are we routing payments to Kevin Bacon now? Shall we open it up to the floor for has anyone got any questions?
Comments on this real quick. You mentioned top-heavy risks of the Lightning Network, and there are some. There are some fringe risks there. If you have a centralized network topology, for example, or something goes wrong and a lot of channels have to close at the same time, then that could actually be difficult to get all the settlement transactions confirmed on chain, which is a bigger risk than Bitcoin normally has, because then it means people can actually steal your money. The channel can settle in someone else's benefit. So that's a maybe fringe, but it's an additional risk. It makes the Lightning Network maybe slightly less secure than on-chain, but in a way you could argue that's a good thing, because that also means there's demand for on-chain just to mitigate this small risk, and we still do want demand for on-chain transactions because fees need to be paid.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different type of transaction. So if you have more options and more, variety of the method of transaction, that's usually a good thing, as long as the functionality is not being pushed to the chain unduly. Yeah.
I mean, Lightning Network is always opt-in, so any risk is still opt-in. That's good.
Shall we open it up to the floor? Has anybody got any questions? I think we've got a few minutes.
Hi, yeah, thanks, guys. Good discussion. I wonder what you think about, it seems very relevant to this thing about shared fiction and the risk of forks. What do you think about ossification? Do you think, as I do, that it's desirable, but you're not really sure if and when it's ever going to happen?
Do you want to start, Felix?
I mean, there are pros and cons for ossification of the protocol, right? So the coins might be more reckless in terms of how they adopt new cryptographic primitives, which are not maybe yet proven, but they took a risk and they got the reward of it not being broken. I think it's fine that Bitcoin takes a more conservative approach there, because it's really, it's people often talk about honey badger, but I think Bitcoin still can fail, and it's not impossible and invincible. We can take a lot of steps to mitigate that, and I'm thinking right now we're doing that. But then, yeah, there's the risk that other chains might adopt certain things faster. I want to see Taproot and also L2 come pretty soon, because I think it makes Lightning a lot easier to reason about from a technical perspective, and it also has less risks for like some weird nuances with the transaction fees. But yeah, if there's no consensus to be found that this gets activated, then I guess that's going to be the way it is.
Ossification is really interesting, right? Because we want to be able to change to new things, and especially when bugs come up, we want to be able to fix them, and that's very important. But on the other hand, we don't want to break our contracts, and especially the long-term agreements that we've made amongst our peers. So I would say that if you run Nakamoto consensus, it's not just a thing for today. You also somewhat commit to this consensus protocol for the future, because after all, a currency, money, is what you hold in order to spend for the future. So if we start recklessly breaking our word and the contract that we so far agreed upon, that messes up the economic calculation for the future. So in this sense, it's very powerful to have ossification in the protocol that define the money. I mean, how often do the atomic rules of gold change? Like, never. It's just gold is gold with, what, 73 neutrons or something. And this doesn't change. And that's good that it doesn't change, because then you can build your economic calculation on top of such a sound and indestructible monetary asset that is, in its rule set, unchanging and unwavering. So I think this is, at both times, Bitcoin's biggest strength, because it allows us to use this, what is now Libra and censorship-resistant money, also in the future, knowing that it will still be Libra censorship-resistant money. But on the other hand, if something critical comes up, and if we really find a technology that would solve the same problem much more eloquently, then can we still have a protocol that is adaptive to these changes, like, for example, Schnorr signatures? So hopefully we get Schnorr and L2 into the protocol, and then ossification. That will be dope.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this shared fiction that is Bitcoin is that it's decentralized. There's no one to determine this is Bitcoin. So we got to figure out how to actually keep everyone on the same page in this shared fiction that there's no, which is decentralized. And I think one way to do that works fairly well is to have some sort of meta consensus that in case of doubt, you go back to what did we all agree on, and then sort of what's compatible with that. And I think that's where this conservative development process kind of comes from. If you keep changing it, then it breaks down much easier than if you're very conservative and make sure that the rules that we had are still viable and you can still keep using them. That's in this decentralized community. It's kind of the only viable solution I can think of, or it's the best solution I can think of.
You know, that's kind of like scaling with layers. We have this payment channel, and
Sure.
the two peers agree, they are in consensus what the correct state is. And in the sense, or in the case that they are no longer in consensus, where one party believes he has more money than the other party thinks, then we can settle back on the main chain, and here we actually have the consensus enforced by full nodes. So, quite interesting.
Yeah, so ossification has downsides, but it's at least it's sort of viable. So
The question is when. When do we draw the line? We may all draw the line in different places. It's a bit like the Luddites, right? You know, they said no technology after 1981. That's the level of technology that we want. So that's the worry, that we don't all agree on that, where that line is.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Soon TM. Have we got time for one more question?
Yeah, from what I understand, in the early development of the internet, something happened that is called the Eternal September. And the internet used to be a university network, and every September there was a new batch of students who need to be taught about what the internet is about and how to behave. And at some point, the influx of new people becomes so huge that they couldn't teach new users anymore. And it was like an eternal September where there were continuously new people who did not behave the way that the original people of the internet thought people should behave.
And so,
Do you think something like that has happened or will happen in Bitcoin, and what will its effects be? How should we deal with that?
I think I saw it on Game of Thrones.
yeah, I think that's like that. The only thing you can do against that is like really education, right? When I say education, I don't only mean like necessarily in English language. I think Warren, they gave a talk yesterday about translating into different languages. There's this really, I think, a lack of non-English material still to explain the basics and the technology of Bitcoin. and if that doesn't change, then that the eternal September risk becomes a very real risk and gets larger. I think so some people just see Bitcoin as this, oh, this thing goes up 20% every week, and you might consider them as the speculators, right? They put like a top, and then the people who understand it, they might put like the local bottom, if you want to look at that. So if these two diverge too much, then there might be like some systemic risks, and people say like, oh, let's just build a larger tower because large towers are cool. Then they might eventually fall apart, right?
Yeah, very, very great points. And I mean, the thing with the Eternal September is that we can no longer do education, right? Because so many people come in, or at least no longer direct education, maybe. And then the question is, how can we infuse this ethos of liberty into the code itself? Because I think that is, for example, the case with encryption. Like if you use GPG, like this is pure anarchy, this is pure freedom. And even if you use it when you're a complete status that wants to control and tyrannize over everyone, when you use GPG, you're still a free sovereign individual. And I guess the same would be the case in Bitcoin. Even if the no-coiners that really don't care about freedom and don't really prioritize for this, that they still use the software, and because they use it, they become more free. And I think then at this point, we don't really need too much direct education. Just like, for example, if you use WhatsApp, you don't really need to be educated how Omemo encryption works. It just is there and it works. And it's good for you in the sense without you even knowing the details of how it works and why it's important. So I'm curious to see how far we can get this, and of course education is vitally important. But do we ever reach that point in the protocol where we just have the liberty baked in?
Just going to be interesting maybe in, I don't know, in 50 years time or so, like we will actually teach basic internet and basic cryptography in schools, right? So people understand those things from a very early age on. I don't think that's going to happen. I hope it's happening, but we will have to see how the education system goes along.
Yeah, there's another example I thought was fun. You already mentioned WhatsApp encryption. Back in the 90s, you had the crypto wars, right? So yeah, the cypherpunks were sort of the freedom fighters of that day, or they were fighting for encryption, trying to stop it from getting banned. And if you read the cypherpunks mailing list, it's kind of interesting or fun to see that there was this discussion back then about cypherpunk culture. For example, Eric Hughes, who's one of the co-founders of the cypherpunks, he actually didn't like this libertarian ethos that was sort of mixed in. And he kind of rejected that, and he wished people didn't keep conflating like anarcho-capitalism and that sort of stuff with cypherpunks. He was just for privacy, and he wanted privacy. Later in the 90s, you had gun rights discussions start popping up in the cypherpunks mailing list, and other people didn't like that either. Like Weis would oppose that, but the mailing list was a typical anarchist mailing list. There was no moderation, therefore there was also a lot of spam and flame wars. And Tim May's way of dealing with it was, if you want to talk more about encryption, talk more about encryption, and just ignore the gun rights threat. Now the cypherpunks and the freedom fighters, and they won that war in the 90s. And nowadays encryption is everywhere, right? So it's in WhatsApp, it's in our chat apps. It's if you visit the web page, you have the HTTPS encryption. It's everywhere, and not everyone who uses WhatsApp is also for guns, or like that. It became separated as encryption grew. That culture just sort of forgotten in the 90s, and it's not associated with each other anymore. And still, everyone uses encryption. So, that's the good news for people who don't like guns or meat. If Bitcoin continues to grow, that will probably people just forgot about that, and people use Bitcoin.
Have we got an Udi in the house, or should we keep going with questions? Keep going. There's one over here.
Yes. Thank you for this opportunity, and I hope you allow me to bring up a slightly less technical topic, but I think the combination of economic and social risks would also include regulatory risks. And a topic that I hope we can also discuss is the upcoming standards from the Financial Action Task Force that are going into effect on June 20. And I'm sure one of you can explain it much better than I, but it has to do that all the 36 biggest economies are going to oblige every party to keep track of every transaction that's being done in cryptocurrencies or blockchain, keep track of who's sending it and who's receiving it, identifying information, and be able to provide that information to the authorities. Now, this is a topic that I haven't seen being discussed on many panels in the last week, and I hope perhaps you can give a brief view on that and how you think that might impact Bitcoin and other currencies and blockchain in more general.
Yeah, so the way you explain it is not quite accurate. This is the travel rule, is what it's about, and it applies to Bitcoin companies, basically. It doesn't apply to individuals. It applies to Bitcoin companies. So what's going to change and what's causing some controversy is right now you can withdraw your Bitcoins from any, from any exchange or any wallet provider and have it withdraw to an address, and they don't really need to care, like just send to that address. That's all they need to care about. With the travel rule, they do need to care. They need to care where this money is actually going. Specifically, they need to know if it's going to another exchange or another wallet provider or something like that. And if that happens, they need to share the KYC information they have from you with that other exchange. So it's quite bad for privacy, and it's also because your personal information is all of a sudden maybe going to be shared with, if you're Dutch or if you're European, it's going to be shared with an American company. And now, the United States could get it, and that's bad. It's also going to cause a lot of overhead for these companies, and they're not even sure how they're going to deal with it. It seems that the Fed doesn't care. They just think they're going to have to deal with it, figure it out. So that's, I think it seems like a big problem that's right in front of us, and or at least for companies. The silver lining maybe is Chainalysis is also against it, and their argument would be that it would actually move more transactions to the individual and to decentralized exchanges and sort of get it out of the regulatory part of the industry. So that could be a silver lining maybe, but it's coming up, and it's not that often discussed, and it seems like a big deal that maybe deserves some more attention, and it could really change how Bitcoin businesses operate and how it affects all of our privacy. And it could even lead to somehow these companies need to be aware of which addresses belong to other companies. So maybe they're speculating maybe there needs to be some sort of SWIFT network for Bitcoin companies, and who knows what kind of bigger effects that could have for Bitcoin in general.
Yeah, when we have these overlapping white and black markets in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency networks in general. So I wonder if we see these kind of regulatory chokeholds or strangle points that will just push everything or push things back towards a black market mode of operation.
I think I don't know specifically about the travel rule much. I probably have to read up about that. But generally, what I always think about large KYC and that kind of stuff is that it creates initial risk, right? So maybe the exchange has your home address, right? And exchanges get hacked. So sometimes maybe they lose Bitcoin. Sometimes they have good stuff in place, but now they have this address list of all these Bitcoin holders, right? So that's when I would be like a malicious person. I would probably start my $5 rent attack looking through these lists. Or I think you should also probably just buy your hardware wallet on like a conference, right? Not so they don't have an address of yours.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard fork, right? You're being forced to run new rules on top of the rules of Bitcoin already. And it's a hard fork that only applies to businesses, not to individuals, right? But still, you're being forced aggressively to use rules that you don't agree with. And of course, that's malicious and that's evil, so the regulation is definitely not good. Well, the thing is, still, we are individuals, right? And what software you run and which communication protocol you choose is up to you. Now, the question is, how much aggression can the malicious actor apply on you and coerce you to eventually do this? Because, I mean, after the $5 wrench attack gets worse and worse and worse, eventually you will have to comply. And that's usually how the state operates. So I'm pretty sure that a bunch of businesses will have to bow down to the masters here, and that will suck. But I agree with Aaron here that we will just move to more censorship-resistant tools, because as Eric Voskio says pretty well, Bitcoin is black market money. And per definition, we are fighting against every regulation from the state because we are peaceful individuals and the state is not. So this is an inherent clash, and I don't think we can ever resolve it. So this will continue, and individuals will continue breaking immoral laws like this spying regulation here for sure. So the solution, well, run your own full node and use Wasabi. Well, I guess Udi is up next, so hopefully he doesn't break Wasabi too much. So don't break it. Let us first do coin joins and then continue.
See if that ages well.
So should we wrap things up? I guess Udi's ready by now. Okay, thanks very much, panelists, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Wassim.
Thank you.